Okay, it's all you, Kevin.
Alrighty. Okay, so this has been kind of soft titled LLM in a box because I could not think of a better title. To be honest, I'm going to keep it relatively high level because a lot of you guys are pretty familiar with everything I did. But I think the fact that I kind of put it all together will, kind of spark up ideas. Maybe you'll have questions about different facets of it that I didn't cover. So I want to try to get through the presentation and then we can do like a little discussion, talk about what happened here. So this project, I took it on because I take on a project that's kind of unrelated to my research frequently, mostly because I used to be a software engineer and now I am not. And it actually takes a lot of work to keep up where I was. I often laugh with all my friends who are still software engineers in the industry that I've kind of become feral since entering academia. So, all the like clean code and stuff that they drill into you in industry kind of just starts to fade away as you get into academia. So I take on these projects specifically to avoid that outcome and keep my code clean. But yeah, so this one was so the inspiration for this project came from a GW law student coming to me, basically saying that he wanted to build a RAG application using LLMs for specifically use with law related topics, and makes perfect sense to me. There are a lot of different industries that could benefit from using LLMs. However, the thing in its face that is a problem is that using something like ChatGPT for a field like law, where the data is super, sensitive, can be really problematic. And so that's why a lot of these industries aren't getting into AI on purpose. They're purposefully avoiding it to avoid the privacy constraints. So I'm going to start my presentation by having us quickly examine our relationship with these software as a service kind of tools that we use daily. So I want you guys to think about how you interact with things like Google and Jira and Slack and whatever other important software as a service that we use every day that we're constantly feeding all of our personal data into. So if we wanted to protect this data, we obviously could run software locally for ourselves. However, that doesn't work for most things. Like you couldn't run Google on your computer. You're not going to run Google from home, and you're certainly not going to run a major communication platform from home either. So that being said, throw on top of it all the proprietary technology and all of this software that you can't have access to. And that's it. You just can't use it. So you give away your private data because you kind of have no choice. Is either use the tool or don't use the tool. And so that is kind of the established relationship we all have with software as a service. However, as we get into more advanced AI and you think of things like ChatGPT and such, you realize that that relationship kind of changes when you get into this more general ChatGPT type AGI almost, can do lots of different things, can add lots of different things by just being a thinking model. So if you think about it, a ChatGPT-esque model, and ChatGPT is very much more than a model, it's a product. So I don't want to get that confused. But it is based on a simple AI model that you can get a lot of information out of and you can do a lot of things with. And so if that model was open, you could just use it as is. And you wouldn't have to feed any specialized, private data into any tool that basically will just harvest your data and sell it. So if you can run an LLM locally and it doesn't require any proprietary software like other services, then this relationship kind of disappears when more publicly available LLMs are on the internet. So we're talking about open source, open weight type models. So there's been a lot of advancements recently, and you guys probably are watching checking the pulse of this constantly, of different updates that allow for open source LLMs to be more accessible to just everyday people. So I wanted to talk about a couple of these. I don't know if you guys have seen the Open LLM leaderboard on Hugging Face, but it's constantly being updated. It's constantly changing, and they have different categories for different like GPU size, essentially, whether it be edge devices to consumer devices to for the GPU rich, essentially businesses that have the money to have tons of GPUs. You throw it on top of things like advancements like quantization, optimized embedding search, and you get a formula that allows for way less GPU power to be running like pretty high level LLMs and high level LLM type software, which is why I included the embedding search stuff, because that's super useful for RAG applications, which I'll talk about later on. And this figure here is specifically to talk about how quantization can use considerably less space on, let's say, GPU RAM for running a model without a huge degradation in performance. As you can see in this figure, it actually is a very, very small amount of degradation in accuracy on, I think this was for an MMLU, one of the many benchmarks that these LLMs are like kind of evaluated on. So what I wanted to do was say, okay, could I build a basic private hardware device that someone could put on their desk and they could use it as, let's say, their own personal AI, or a business could use it as their own personal AI. And this was originally tailored specifically for a lawyer to use, but it would apply to a lot of different things beyond that. So I basically went down this rabbit hole of small form factor computers. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different type of like personal computers that you can build based on case size, motherboard size, things like this. So the smallest one is the small form factor computer, which could be like very small, like laptop size at the very smallest. So I wanted to build something that would be able to run today's best, highest intelligence, we'll say, for lack of a better word, or highest performance LLMs on the smallest hardware that I could get in like to this little box, essentially. So I had to figure out what were the important aspects of that, which we can discuss if you guys care about it. But the most important aspects were the GPU, obviously, because it has to be a big enough GPU with enough power and enough RAM to run a large model. And obviously a PSU to support that power-wise. Obviously, you need a motherboard that fits in your case and a case that's small. So those are the main factors that I used. And I think the mini ITX tower was what I ended up using for the mini ITX case, which is a motherboard shape if you're not familiar. So the one thing I want to talk about is another reason I did this was because AI, these models have been getting better at a rate that allows us to run decent performing models on our computers. So before, let's say about a year ago, we were in a situation where you could get a model running, let's say like a Llama 2 running on your computer, but Llama 2 was kind of okay, maybe not good enough for any commercial type purpose, but it was a model. So it wasn't useful for anything real. However, there are definitely commercial use cases for the quality of small models that exist today. So I contrast it with Llama 2 and Qwen 2.5, and I give the release dates for each, just a year apart. So these models have been getting better faster. And I think Qwen 2.5 is a great example of an open source that starts to almost surpass some of the closed source stuff, because Qwen's models are pretty much in competition with OpenAI right now in terms of some of their VLMs and their O1 competitor as well. So that means that these models are ready for important commercial use. However, you need to be able to use them in a private setting. So I essentially built this box so that anyone could have a personal AI that sits on their desk at all times. And It can run about an 8 billion model parameter, maybe a little bit bigger with quantization. And the performance is really fast, actually. Like it takes about 2 seconds for a full like RAG query, meaning I can retrieve information from a database of embeddings and generate a reasonable output to a, let's say, law-related question. And I tested this on a piece of legislation that came out a couple months ago in California that was basically an AI regulation bill. And so I just started feeding in the bill, and then I started asking the model questions about it, and it was responding perfectly. So like it can distill the information in the bill, get to the embeddings that are relevant, and output a reasonable answer. And so that means that it can perform a lot of interesting like summarization tasks, RAG type questioning of a document, finding specific items in a document, things like this. All of this, and keep in mind, the difference between doing this in ChatGPT and doing this on this LLM in a box is that the document that you feed into the LLM will never leave your computer. And so that's the main thing, is that there is stuff running in your network that will never leave your network. And that's the key, privacy aha moment, is that you never have to let anything get out of your system for the sake of protecting it, essentially. Since then, everything has changed. Literally, this industry will not like sit quietly for 6 months. So my little project here is already completely, like it's useless. Compare it to some of the stuff that's come out recently with like some of the performance improvements of DeepSeek versus this is a picture of NVIDIA's new Project Digits, which is essentially their supercomputer that you can put on your desk, which is considerably smaller than the 3090 I crammed into this small form factor case. And it uses their new Blackwell architecture to basically create a tiny little supercomputer. And it's also faster than this 3090 as well. So already you can see that in the next 6 months, this kind of product is going to start flooding the market, because this was, again, what cutting edge looked like in 2024. And in 2025, it's already completely changed to the point that what if this was maybe a business could use this, maybe this is the future of private LLMs, this is a sure thing, where the models are now, smarter. At least a model that you can run an 8 billion parameter model that's almost as smart as ChatGPT 4.0 at this point. And you can run it on a piece of hardware the size of, at some point it's going to be like an Altoids box. So this is already really small.
How big is that?
That's
I don't see a dimension.
it's smaller than a MacBook. So it's probably like if you were to stack 4 iPhones, it's maybe the size of that.
Is somebody selling it online?
Yeah, you can look it up. It's called Project Digits. It's an NVIDIA product.
It's expensive.
Yes, but
It'll come down. But
it'll come down.
Yeah,
it'll come down quickly. And I think that a lot of people are going to be looking for their own private personal AI. And it kind of wasn't necessarily possible in a reasonable way. Like, you'd either need to settle for a model that's not particularly powerful, or for a hardware rig that's unbelievably powerful. And so now you're going to get the best of both worlds, where the models are getting smarter for less parameters, and the hardware is getting to the point that you could have a little box on your desk that runs a heavy-duty LLM, which is great. And it's kind of the future that I foresee for AI, because we no longer have to have these give away all your private data to like software services kind of relationship. Oh, though, and I wanted to throw this in too, because as I was making this presentation, I found a headline saying that some Berkeley lab had already created or tried to recreate some of DeepSeek's math gains on a 3 billion parameter model for like $30 of training. So, you know, like the whole world just gets thrown into uproar by things like this. And but it's important to note that like these are enormous steps toward progress, toward people having their own AI, or people not having to rely on like billion-dollar corporations to both train and serve all of their AI to them. It's something that will be getting democratized to normal people very, very soon. I'm really happy about that. Okay, so who cares? Why would we care about high level, like, you know, getting better models on smaller hardware? Who would care about this? I think the three fields that are affected by this the very most are law, because law is extremely text heavy. Everything in law is text, and I'll talk more about that. But also defense and medical. Defense, of course, I've talked to people in the defense industry, and they'll tell me that their rules with AI are extremely strict because obviously there's tons of sensitive classified data. And apparently the classification of like what's secret, top secret, and such, actually there are rules about aggregating data relative to that too. So an AI model could have access to tons of unclassified models or tons of unclassified data, but then by the model aggregating that data, that intel report suddenly becomes classified. And so the defense industry literally cannot use AI because by feeding in all that information, they're essentially feeding their data, their classified data, into a model that obviously is not supposed to have it. So medical as well, because medical, like, you know, those are people's, you know, private medical data, you know, between doctors and patients. So any industry where there's like a, you know, a reasonable expectation of confidentiality between you and the service, whether that be your doctor and you, or your lawyer and like attorney-client privilege, like those industries are going to benefit from private AI the most. And so I wanted to talk deeper about the law applications because that's what I built all of my software and hardware for specifically. So when I talked to lawyers about whether or not they care about this, they said they definitely do, because data security is part of their attorney-client privilege, and that they hired like whole IT teams specifically to handle data security because any sort of data leak would be really, really detrimental to their business. Meaning you violate attorney-client privilege, there are huge repercussions to you, and there are huge repercussions to your reputation as well. Also, if you ever have worked with a lawyer, you would know that almost all of what they do for like a lot of transactional lawyers is they draft a document, they send a document to another lawyer, the lawyer looks at the document, they go over the document, make some changes, arbitrary changes, send it back, and you go back and forth 20 times with minor changes of a document. So these are tasks that AI are perfect for. It's feed in a bunch of data, read a lot of text, summarize the text, give details about what changed, and then discuss it essentially. So the lots of back and forth and lots of minor edits and summaries are really, really useful for LLMs to process. RAG is a super useful tool for lawyers. If you think about general questions that people have on case law, you could be looking up legal precedent without any encyclopedia. You could be looking up legal precedent by essentially just searching, if you have a data set of case law available to you. So that could make, you know, a process that often takes lawyers like tens or hundreds of hours into a one or two lookups, which would save a ton of money. And if you think about the cost to the client of that lawyer's time, that cost is immediate, right? So hundreds of hours to 1 to 2 lookups is a giant like chunk of change for someone who's like hiring their attorney. So it makes a big difference. Yeah.
Isn't the archive of case law all publicly available?
So there is publicly available case law. However, your questions to an LLM would not be public. So if you bring that under your, you know, if you bring it to the point that you are bringing everything under your systems, then you don't have to ask a public question to a public data. You can ask a private question to that public data. And beyond that, there is the non-public aspect of this data, meaning you could have a lot of data. So, okay, I'll give a hypothetical that I think people will like. Let's say you're representing someone in court and you have to answer a very difficult question, like, can the president commit a crime? However, you don't know the answer. So you have to look this up in about 300 years of American case law to see if there's any legal precedent, or to see if there's any reason to believe that the president can commit a crime and essentially still be, like, to be not caught and not like made accountable for it, essentially. So how do you answer that question? You have to be able to look it up. But if you're looking it up through any public means, or you're Googling it or something like that, like essentially you're feeding that information, which is super, super sensitive, into some sort of public software service or private software service that's going to take that data and maybe do something with it. You could keep that data as well as the actual evidence that this person committed a crime completely private, and still get all of the like benefits of a Google search or AI searches and stuff like that, if you just kept everything in-house.
Yeah, I was also thinking more about the private stuff. Like, I was involved in a lawsuit with the university, and there were just boxes and boxes of things that were our side's evidence, like transcripts of all the interviews, and whenever they had a question, they had someone bring in another binder, and they'd be like, go get binder such and such, and then we would.
Right.
I mean, it was just a lot of volume of work, and that none of that was public side. That was all like just to facilitate their defending the university side.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting.
And law offices have been slow to digitization because of that. You know, they'd rather keep the binders because they're scared of putting their stuff on public cloud stuff. You know, so it's either have a server room in your law office or keep it in the binders right now. So all of these are issues with, you know, modernization, digitization that law offices face every day. They also keep incredibly detailed notes on every communication going in and out of the law firm. So that's another source of private data that's, you know, like all of those like communications are super private, super sensitive, cannot be let out, as well as like interesting, you know, I think that there's a future for this where you start using vision language models and you can kind of go through picture and text evidence, like someone's text messages, and kind of understand the situation like better, instead of having to read through 3 weeks of someone's messages with their husband or wife in a divorce hearing. You could just have kind of AI go through and be like, all right, well, he did this, this, and that from there, and there's a picture of this, so that kind of tells the story. You don't need to go through it.
Guilty.
Yeah. And so one of the last things I wanted to talk about that was kind of relevant to this was, obviously, if everyone starts using private AI and everyone starts having AI on their own computer, one of the things that's kind of lost from that is the fact that if we're all using ChatGPT, then OpenAI gets all that data and they use it to fine-tune their models and make their models better, obviously. So how can we kind of get those gains that they would get, but still keep our data private? And so I've been thinking about this, and though I haven't actually implemented it into a system yet because we don't have enough computers online to do it, but I think that there's an opportunity here to use federated learning on fine-tuning of LLMs. So the idea behind this is that you have a lot of private data, but everyone is still serving the same purpose. Let's say you have 100 law firms all using these private LLM computers. If they are each fine-tuning an LLM for a specific law purpose, then you could essentially aggregate all of those fine-tuned gains into a superior model without necessarily exposing their private data. So all of these guys could be making their own fine-tuned LLM for themselves, or you could be aggregating those weight changes in different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be as naive as the one in this figure, to essentially maximize the gains of everyone's usage of those LLMs without necessarily exposing their private data, which is exactly why they didn't want to use a privatized, like an OpenAI GPT type thing anyway. So I just thought that would be something really cool to like spark discussion, and because I actually do think that the idea that you can't train a model without exposing your private data seems a little unfair. And I think we could all be doing it without this. Yeah.
Yeah, but doesn't that, like, in terms of like defense, like if part of the problem is like you don't want it to be able to inference these things from the bits and pieces,
Yeah.
isn't the federated learning, like, you wouldn't be able to use that in
I-
a defense context?
I do think it would not be able to be used in specifically the defense context. However, I think in the law and the medical context, if you were still anonymizing your data, it would still be pretty relevant because you would have a lot of very similar cases where, like in the medical context, it would be you get the same people coming in over and over again. Think about when COVID was happening and people started like noticing these patterns of symptoms.
But what about also like in both in medical and even in law, maybe, if you're talking about intellectual property, I've got some secret sauce in this thing that I've made for my business, whether it's, medical industry or any other industry. And then even if the specifics of my personal LLM aren't in there, if it's going back to a sort of a federated system, then somebody else who's a competitor is like, how do I do blah, blah, blah? And they can then, through inferencing, reverse engineer your product.
Yeah, I think that that's feasible technically. I think it'd be pretty tough and it would require a good amount of training on that specific question. But I do think it's potentially feasible, and some people wouldn't want to subscribe to this essentially. And it wouldn't be something that everyone want to do, but at least you would have the choice to either have, right? Because like this is essentially presenting people with a choice, like either fine tune on your own data or fine tune on everyone's data.
Right.
And maybe there's potentially, it's kind of weird because in a normal setting that you would never be able to go back from, you would never during inference be able to go back to the training data. However, you've definitely seen LLMs reference real stuff all the time, so it can get back to it. So it'd just be a matter of making sure that that's not possible, right? Which involves a lot of anonymization of data, like people do now.
It's not even though going like, let's say I've got, a thing that I've made, I'm selling it. I've got my patents. It's like, but really it's just widget A plus widget B. That's like a super simple, stupid idea, but or case, but like, then if I'm, my business that does that is participating in a federated situation, does that make it more likely that somebody else says, I want to do this thing that does this, and it can now put together widget A plus widget B, not like that it's pulling in the exact source data, it's just using inferencing to like figure out like this is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, if that was your whole business, then it would probably be apparent from enough fine tuning on that kind of discussion. Yeah, that's definitely true. But
wouldn't that only happen if you brought all his weights in?
Absolutely.
If you just sampled his weights.
Yeah.
If everyone in the federation, you just took 1% of their weights.
That everyone would be a little bit better at, the question in which your answer is, why don't you combine widget A and widget B in this regard? That would be a more likely response from the LLM because you specifically trained it on a little bit of that data. But everyone would get a little bit of the gains from everyone else.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. If you would want to like really, really insulate yourself, then you would definitely not participate in any federated learning.
I mean, actually, I'm wondering if you, even by completely insulating yourself, you can't stop inference. Like if there are enough just pieces out, and we all live in a shared world. If there's enough pieces out there, you can inference stuff. And then
This is a less.
Well, there's no new ideas, they say. Eventually someone's gonna come to the same idea as you just threw.
Right.
enough people querying enough things, they'll eventually, just through odds,
Right,
come
right,
to your same idea.
yeah.
Do you think there'd be an incentive to share? It sounds like there's a lot of work in anonymizing and.
I think there'd be a
and
huge
there's a lot of
incentive.
risk.
Yeah, I think
What
that'd
was
be huge. So the thing is that the problem with using LLMs for a specific use case is that they are LLMs that are not for a specific use case, right? If you just throw Llama 3 at any given thing, it might be good at that thing. It might be terrible at that thing. So the idea that these models are not equally good at everything. So when you want to do it for a specific thing, fine-tuning eventually just makes sense, right? You want it to be very, very good at the one thing you care about. So I actually do think there will be incentive for people to use this because they would want a model that's better at answering the questions that they are more likely to ask, if that makes sense.
Well, I understand why they'd want to fine tune it, but I don't understand why they'd want to share with.
It's a matter of like everyone getting the gains that everyone getting a different level of gains from everyone else.
That doesn't feel like lawyerly talk.
I don't think that everyone would subscribe to this. But at the same time, it's more of like so this is like my worldview, right? It's like I don't believe, I don't believe that we all need to be using private LLMs. I actually think that we can get a lot of the gains that like this system would get a lot of the gains that private LLMs are getting by just being a one-stop shop for everyone, like OpenAI. So if we don't do that, we're losing out, right? If we all used OpenAI's models, they would be really, really good, but they would own that. And we would have just been making them really, really good for the purposes of, I don't know, enriching them versus being useful for whatever we want to use it for without any cost to us. So that's kind of the idea behind the federated learning stuff. Do I think lawyers would use it? Maybe.
How would you safeguard a federated system from bad actors who just want to like, okay, we're going to start contributing some serious garbage just to like degrade the system?
Well,
I mean, is there any way to like?
You want to curate it.
Yeah.
Best.
So the thing is that when you actually go through and you're like kind of aggregating these weight changes and stuff, you would be doing benchmarks. So if someone's data is actually negatively affecting those benchmarks, like let's say I create my own benchmark of how well an LLM answers a legal question.
Right.
If it starts hurting those benchmarks, I wouldn't include those weight changes because those weight changes are literally detrimental to our performance. But yeah, essentially you would have to prescribe some sort of benchmark for the things you care about, and you would be running them on all of the weight changes and seeing whose weight changes are actually improving it the most.
Right.
Who gets to decide what are the different components or the different branches or graph in a federated learning? Because I think you want them to be similar enough so that the weights trained on the various models have some shareable properties. But if you start to pull together things that are not answering exactly the same question, then it's kind of reversing the process of fine-tuning a little bit. Because the whole purpose of fine-tuning is to, create a more general model and apply it to their specific use case. But once you start federated learning, I'm just wondering if you would accidentally introduce some noise by combining models that are not answering that.
It depends on how specific you want to be. So the thing about the fine tuning is that it would make the model perform better at a specific task that you're fine tuning it for. If you're fine tuning it specifically for divorce court stuff and you start getting into criminal court stuff, or you start getting into some sort of transactional business law that has nothing to do with that, obviously that creates noise if you are focusing on one specific type of law. However, if you're just trying to make it better at answering legal questions in a more general sense, then you can incorporate, it's a matter of what data do you pick to fine tune on. So as long as you're focused in a general sense, it should be fine. If all of these devices, let's say 3 of them are focused on one type of law and the 4th is a totally different type of law, you're absolutely right.
I could see it being like the firm would do better rated within its own firm.
Absolutely. Yeah, because
you have 300 lawyers and you're all using the same LLM, then just use all their data to keep making it better and better without ever releasing it beyond the firm to get competitive advantage.
Yeah, that's absolutely
You'll have a
true.
better LLM than everyone else.
Yeah, each attorney could have their own device too, right? They have their own device. The whole firm trains on, every individual lawyer's device. While you don't even expose, data inter-firm, which is probably an even tighter security, which some people may care about, some people may not.
Yeah, you would just incentivize bigger firms.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
they're already incentivized for bigger firms.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually the last topic I thought that would definitely spur discussion. So I wanted to open up a more general discussion because I did a lot of different stuff here. I don't know that people would care to talk about hardware, software, or AI in general because, full disclaimer, this is not what my normal research is. My normal research is actually like computer vision and vision language models, but I just had to do this because the opportunity was there, and I otherwise, I'd suck at coding by now.
That's awesome.
I like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I had a question. I know that you're building the hardware because you want a low-class solution, but I think because the data is very sensitive and security purposes, but I think I think there's like things like the government intelligence agencies, for example, they use the cloud and they have highly sensitive data. So is the paranoia and a bit of like law firms warranted when there's like government using cloud?
I think that a lot of law firms and hospitals would actually like their data security to be better than that of the government. But I do agree that cloud providers have been working really, really hard to make sure that their cloud is as safe as possible for data security purposes. But they're doing that specifically because they recognize how inherently insecure the cloud is for this data, and they want to attract customers to their cloud solutions. So the truth of the matter is that there's nothing more secure than having your data on-prem. Like, it's not even close. So it doesn't matter if you have the most secure Azure government, whatever installation, this is still better, right? So you can't deny the inherent gains you would get from having superior security. And I think that while most people adopted cloud because they didn't want to store terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of information on-prem because they didn't want to pay for the data center or have their own hardware. The use of AI is kind of different because you would be exposing what you're actually thinking about and what you're actually like wanting to learn about. So you would be exposing yourself in a different way, like it's not like, oh, I have a data set or a database of information and some of it may incriminate the president. But if you're asking the question, if you're Googling, can the president be, if the president can be accused of a crime, that's like kind of the smoking gun if you send it to Google. So it's a little different than storing your data in the cloud.
Yeah, I have questions about, is RAG like a giant context window, basically? And are there limits to it? And are there times where if you feed it too much data that you'll actually create the noise itself? And
so yes and no. So the way RAG works is you take a document or a set of documents and you break it down into these chunks. So let's say I use a chunk size of 256 characters. That means that it'll take essentially what's like 256 character paragraph and break down the text into those chunk sizes with a certain amount of overlap, and it'll turn those into embeddings. Those embeddings are kind of distilling the information into numbers. Then, when you ask a question of the RAG model, it goes to, let's say, an embeddings database of all of the embeddings that you just generated, and it finds like a nearest neighbor approach to find what's most relevant to it. So it doesn't matter how much information you give it, it will always find what is the most relevant information to the question you're asking. And then it takes that information as the context. So it'll grab, let's say, the 3 or 5 closest embeddings, and then based on the information in those embeddings, it will generate an answer using all of that information in context.
But in your example where the lawyers go back and forth, and change the document slightly over and over again, how would it know like that the latest version is the most important version, and that all those previous versions are wrong?
So you would just be updating, your context essentially. So you would probably compare the embeddings of the last draft and your new draft, and you would be going over what the differences are, where they are, and how they're relevant to the document. But it's still
in the system.
Yeah, so
Start ignoring older things.
Okay.
yeah, so you wouldn't have unlimited context. You would just have a limited context of the most relevant information. You could, I mean, there are definitely systems in which you could have you would run out of context, like your context window, because you had like 20 plus different documents involved, but you definitely would want to avoid that and summarize. And like a lot of RAG systems will try to make that context window work harder for them by, instead of using whole documents, they'll use specifically differences in documents or specifically summarizations of differences in documents too, to make that window work better for you.
RAG is really interesting. Like at first it was just like take the top 5, and now there's like 20 steps of things people do with RAG to get better and better results.
Yeah, it's pretty, so the version that I built here is actually a very basic version of RAG, but if you start including more and more queries to the LLM, like, is the information I pulled relevant to the question? Is this a good answer to the question? Like things like that, like you can actually get the LLM to kind of, chain of thought itself into a better answer much faster. But again, I didn't do that because this is supposed to be a very low compute version of RAG.
So there's still concerns for the studying, or because mostly
So the idea of this was that it would be primarily RAG, because the RAG version of this doesn't necessarily have to deal with hallucinations, because it's going to be referencing directly from some sort of source. And that source would be either internal documents or, let's say, case law that's publicly available. So the RAG version of this does not suffer from hallucinations. If you were to use a different form of this where you use an LLM to update documents, for example, then you could potentially run into real hallucination problems. But I actually personally haven't seen it yet, though I'm aware that it's definitely a problem.
Do you have any sense of like a cadence for updating the model when the new version comes out, or adding new documents, or enabling like the latest accessing the live internet while you're into your system, that kind of thing?
So in terms of accessing the internet, I hadn't messed with that yet, because I was very one-track minds on the purpose of this, which is to only use private documents and not go outside of that at all. So the version of this I was going to give to people was, it's a box, it's not even connected to the internet because you don't need the internet, and it's got it's got a huge data set of case law on box already, and you just add your data to it and it can do all sorts of stuff with just that. So I didn't bother trying to connect it to the internet, because the whole point is to be like, this will never leave your network. Yeah, I think I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm still curious about like, how often would they want to refresh?
Oh yeah, so they definitely would want to refresh. And to be honest, the which model is going to be the best at this task is going to change every single day. Like actually every single day. So so that being said, the way I set it up, I just use Hugging Face because Hugging Face has all of the top like open LLMs available pretty much. If you have a big open LLM, you're going to release it on Hugging Face. And so for using Hugging Face models, it's actually really, really simple, like plug and play. So I actually have a config on Box that you just type in the name of the model and it just inserts it into the Hugging Face configuration and grabs the model and then runs it. So you just have to change like a word, essentially.
How do you know which new model to pick?
Well, you would get someone who understands what the best model is. You probably wouldn't want like a lawyer or like a hospital or whatever, whoever's using it to do that. So for the technical side, it would just be like a config change, right? So you would want someone like, I don't know, someone like me who actually knows what like a good model is, or someone who can evaluate the like basic benchmarks to like just be changing the model whenever.
And how long does it take to rerun it?
2 seconds.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Do you see the future application of AI in the law environment? Because law is like very complex, and it's not just like straightforward. How do you see that?
So I actually see it specifically evolving with a product like this. I don't know whether it'll be this exact product, whether it's just like a private LLM box, or whether it's something the larger scale and more closed source, like a GPT that's fine-tuned on law stuff that you can add more data to. But I do see purpose-built AI products for specific law practices. There are tons, and I mean tons, of small tasks and automation, like things that are automation ready, that lawyers are passing off to legal assistants and paralegals every day. And those tasks are really often like make a basic boilerplate for this type of document or organize these documents from this client, things like that. Those tasks are super available for LLMs to be picking up, and they don't do it because that data is so private and they would never expose it. So I feel like the only real issue for these firms getting into AI is how private can I make it? And how general purpose are the models? Like, are they actually going to work for all of what I need, or do I need to have them like a lot of things are a lot of basic like apps today are just a thin layer of code over a ChatGPT model. So how quickly can you iterate a thin layer of code on top of a private AI model? So it would just be a matter of making small app updates, right? And then you're just updating a private model. But yeah, I think that's the future for like law offices and I think hospitals especially.
But that's like traditional automation that can be applied anywhere, like small documents, it's like small tasks.
Yeah.
But I was thinking like the bigger picture where, like an AI lawyer where it can do everything.
So I guess what you're talking about is sort of like, when does AGI become lawyer level? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, like it can do the analogy, like it can reason, not just like do a task, but it can think and give you an answer about.
Right. And so those models are available today. Those models exist today. Good reasoning models, like I think that 0103 GPT, as well as DeepSeek, are definitely they've passed a lot of tests in terms of like their ability to do reasoning. Those models are also hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of parameters, and so they're not going to run on your everyday LLM box. So that's kind of the disconnect right now, is that the highest echelon of AI model is still not even close to available for an everyday consumer. And so that's kind of where the problem is. But there are good models that can be used for a lot of important things that can run on like an Xbox. So,
What are?
But the law also isn't reasoning. That's where the other problem comes in, is that, like, when I talk to friends who are lawyers,
Mhm.
they're like, we're not worried. They're worried about pipeline issues because of automation, and
Yeah.
how will we get new lawyers? But the law doesn't reason. The law is about a lot of things, but reasoning is only one of them. It's not logic, it's legal, and it changes, and I think, like, a good lawyer goes in and knows the judge and knows the judge's case history, and if the judge went golfing with someone yesterday, and all those things filter into legal decisions that LLMs being non-embodied just, and we like to think that it's logical.
yeah, but
Logic is only a small part of the law.
yeah, I think that the part that the LLMs are actually going to participate in is actually the establishment of the law is essentially a big set of rules, huge set of rules, and you have to make sure that whatever is happening is within the bounds of those rules. And the LLM is really, really good at finding where all the rules are in, the thousands of years of case law that exists in the world. Yeah.
Or interpreting the rules.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Finding the rules.
The
Right.
interpretation, like that's the thing that I don't know if any AI, even a reasoning AI, can do interpretation. Like the problem with the law is that it's a little fuzzy, and I mean, if it wasn't fuzzy, then you wouldn't need trials. It's just like, okay, done.
It's either the problem or it's the good thing of the law. Depends where you.
Yeah.
draw the line.
No,
mean,
I didn't mean to.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it's the good thing. I'm just pointing out that that's like,
Yeah.
that's the limit of what the sort of the law, the limit of the laws is that, I mean, any language is a model which is smaller than the actual universe. So you need humans to figure out what does this mean in the real universe.
Do you have a prediction for when I, as a non-legal human, can just go into my AI and say, I want a will, I want to file for divorce, I want to do whatever, and I don't need a lawyer, and it's trustworthy, and it can go to the courts, and it can represent me just fine?
I would argue you can do that right now.
Okay.
You can do that right now. Just go on ChatGPT, go to, I guess, O1 or higher, and say, I want this legal document. I'm sure it's seen it about 1 million times, and it can spit out the boilerplate for you.
Mm.
Do I think it's trustworthy? I don't know. It depends on how trustworthy you think lawyers are. So
Another example of putting some businesses out.
yeah, but I think the reality is that you can get that document, but you're never gonna do it without a lawyer.
Why not?
I would love to, but if there's a huge hole in it, then
like
you missed
using
it because you didn't talk to a lawyer.
Bought 4 properties and I've never used a real estate agent.
Really?
And they're always like, oh, you have to have a real estate agent to go over
Yeah,
all the legal things. You just download off the state of Virginia website.
right.
That's all they're doing. And there's like 10 boxes you fill in. And they cover 10 boxes worth of stuff with you. Everything else is boilerplate.
Right.
So we're like, why would we ever pay a lawyer or a real estate agent? When it's all set in stone. I mean, they can't even change it if they wanted to.
True. Yeah, it's all
State statute
specialized.
Sets it.
So yeah, so you can do it today.
The hard part, like the divorce would be more difficult because that's very contextualized what your assets are. But like legal for real estate stuff, it's very boilerplate.
Right.
If we're recording, I'm just kidding about the divorce.
No one's asking real questions about a divorce. Yeah, thank you all.
Oh, great. I'm gonna grab some things. I'll be in.